Chapter 4. Alan Stem's alarm about Japan's semiconductor challenge reflected only part of the picture. There was also plenty going on with Japanese research, in addition to information processing. Superconductivity was getting a big push, as was biotechnology, optoelectronics, advanced materials. Although we in the West think of Japan as a newcomer in the high-tech sweepstakes, it actually has a long tradition of innovation. A typical for instance. In the area of advanced materials, those of us hooked on swords know the Japanese were already creating new materials hundreds of years ago that still haven't been bettered. Back then, it was flawless steel for katana blades. Today it's, say, gallium arsenide crystals for laser-driven semiconductors. How, one might inquire, did all this expertise come about? To stick to materials research, if you think a moment you realize it's a discipline that actually must have begun in the latter days of the Stone Age. High technology, in those times, meant figuring new ways to use fire and clay to create something nature had neglected to provide. Not integrated circuits, but a decent water pot. And the Japanese have been making terrific pots for 1,000 years. As it happens, some historians claim the very first Japanese pottery was made in the province of Tamba, near Kyoto. Why mention this? Because, then as now, technology and politics had a way of getting mixed together in Japan. And Tamba was a perfect example. Tamba's artisans made great use of a special oven known as a climbing chambered kiln. Whereas ceramics kilns elsewhere in the country were narrow and high, Tamba's climbing hill chambers were wide and low, thereby allowing the fire to touch the clay directly. The result was a rugged, flame-seared stoneware that pleased the manly eye powerful earthy grays, burnt reds, greenish browns, all with a hard metallic luster. Thus Tamba was a locale much frequented by the warrior shoguns, which may be why Tamba province has another claim to history as well. It is the location of the one-time warrior castle fortress of Sasayama, once a regional command post of the Tokugawa strongmen in Tokyo. You won't find overly much about Sasayama in the usual guidebooks, since it has the kind of history that's more interesting to Japanese than to tourists. The place has no gaudy vermilion temples, no bronze Buddhas 10 stories high. Fact is, very little remains of the fortress itself these days, except for a wide moat, green with lotuses, and a few stone walls lined with cherry trees that blossom an exquisite white for a few breathtaking moments each spring. Although the castle is now burned down, a few homes of the samurai retainers of its various warlords remain. If you stand on the rocky edge of the moat at its southwest corner and look down through the cherry trees, you'll see an old-style house built some 200 years ago by the 12th daimyo of Sasayama for his most loyal retainer. Its walls of white plaster are interspersed with beams of dark wood. Its thatch roof supported by the traditional ridgepole. Think of it as the home of the samurai most trusted, the guardian of the gates, the warrior nearest the fount of power. Perhaps it will not seem surprising, therefore, that this ancient samurai residence, in the shogun stronghold closest to ancient Kyoto, was now home base for a powerful warrior of modern Japan. Matsuo Noda. Samurai had once battled in Sasayama streets. Many's the time its castle had been stormed by raging armies. Much blood had been shed, and much honor lost. But the event that occurred in Sasayama, precisely 2 weeks after Tamara Richardson's dinner in New York, was a historical moment more important than any in its 1,000 years prior. It began shortly after dawn, a cool September gray just ripening to pink over the mountains. The early sounds of morning birdsong, the faint bell of the tofu seller, the steam whistle of the autumn sweet potato vendor were only beginning to intrude on the quiet. Noda was where he always was at this moment, on the veranda overlooking his personal garden, a classic Zen-style landscape whose central pond was circled by natural-appearing rocks, trees, bushes, paths. It was, of course, about as natural as those sculptured hedges at Versailles. In order to create the illusion of perspective and depth, the stones along the foreshore of the pond were bold, rugged, massively detailed, while those on the opposite side were dark, small, smooth a little trick to make them seem farther away than they were. It's a game heavy with nuance. For example, the stone footpath on the left side of the pond may look as if it goes on forever, but that's just part of the art. The stones get smaller toward the back, curving in and out among the azalea bushes till they make one last twist and disappear among the red pines and maples at the rear. Which trees, incidentally, have themselves been slightly dwarfed, again enhancing the illusion of distance. Just as the back is deliberately shaggy and dark, like the beginnings of a forest that goes on for miles. Noda's Zen garden, which deludes rational judgment by manipulating all the signposts we use to gauge distance and space, appeared to be limitless. The secret was that nothing actually ends. Everything simply fades out and gets lost. It was a closed space that seemed for all the world as if it went on, and on if you could only somehow see the rest of it. Yet peek only a few yards away, and you've got the mundane streets of sleepy Sasayama. This special dawn, as a few frogs along the edge of the pond croaked into the brisk air, he knelt on the viewing veranda in a fine cotton morning robe, a yukata emblazoned with his family crest, an archaic Chinese ideogram meaning courage, and began to center his mind. He'd left his Kyoto headquarters early Friday evening, skipping the usual after-hours drinking obligation of Japanese executives, and grabbing the 8:30 Sanin Express to Sano, where his limo waited to bring him the rest of the way home. Now he was up before daybreak and readying his usual morning ritual. As he sat there, gazing across the placid water dotted with lotuses at the foreshore and framed with willows at the far horizon, his silver hair contrasted with the marine blue of the robe to create a presence easily as striking as the garden itself. For a time he merely knelt, silently contemplating the view and listening to the metrical drip of water from a bamboo spout situated just at the edge of the steps. Finally, he turned and picked up his sumi stick, a block of dried ink made from soot, and carefully began to rub it against the concave face of an ancient ink stone till its cupped water darkened to just the proper shade. When the fresh ink was ready, he wet a brush in a separate water vessel, dried it by stroking it against a scrap of old paper, dipped it into the dark liquid, and looked down. This was the moment that demanded perfect composure, absolute control. Before him was a single sheet of rice paper, purest white, and now his hand held the brush poised. He was waiting for that instant when his senses clicked into alignment, when the feel of the brush merged with his mind, much the way a samurai's katana blade must become an extension of his own reflexes. Although he would stroke only a few kanji characters, scarcely enough for telex or a memo, the moment required discipline acquired through decades of practice. His Zen-style calligraphy allowed for no hesitation, no retouching. It must be dashed off with a spontaneity that was, in itself, part of the art. As with the swordsman, there could be no time for conscious thought, merely the powerful stroke guided by intuition. No decision that confronted him throughout a business day would demand half so much mental control, inner resolve. Just then, at the far end of the pond, the first sun flickered through the wisteria. Suddenly, without his consciously knowing the exact moment had arrived, as a Zen archer's arrow must release itself of its own will, his hand struck. The dark tip of the brush pirouetted down the paper, starting at the left and laying down a mere 5 lines, 22 syllables. Inishinai, once held, Ari Kemu Hiro no. It said, Motri Cho, by men of long ago. O Mitsuo wo, my ancient prize, where wa machitari, at last is near. It was done. He sighed, leaned back, and reached for the cup of green tea that rested beside him on the polished boards. The verse was in an archaic style, a few syllables longer than a haiku, modeled on an 800-year-old work by a court poet of the Heian era. The strokes were perfectly nuanced, the flow of the brush precise, the intuitive strength as natural as a waterfall. Noda drained his tea, then rose to go back inside. His antique house was tastefully empty. Its tatami-floored rooms, measured in multiples of those standard 3x6 reed mats, were barren, a museum to times past. They also were open to each other, their sliding doors, fusuma, being pushed wide. The walls, too, were vacant expanses of white plaster with only an occasional mounted 6-fold screen depicting poetry parties of the Heian era. That courtly civilization portrayed in the tale of Genji. And there were no overhead lights, merely an occasional cypress anden floor lamp to augment the pastel glow of the rice paper shop windows. A sahan. He curtly ordered his gray-haired cook to bring breakfast, then turned to mount the ancient stairs. Hi, she nodded and was gone. Although he kept the lower floor exactly as it had been 2 centuries past, the upstairs was a different matter entirely. It had been converted into a high-tech office, hooked through a maximum security telesystems TCS 9000 direct uplink, via the Mid-Pacific Merxby satellite, to the mainframe of his new NEC information management system in the Kyoto headquarters, an augmented NEC's 2400 IMS, which handled voice, data, tech. Image. He had scarcely flipped on the system when the woman who managed his kitchen appeared, bowing, and deposited a tray bearing miso broth, rice, an uncooked egg, and more tea. He grunted thanks as he was checking a CRT screen for the current rate on Fed funds, the cost of the money American banks lend each other overnight to meet reserve requirements. No surprises. Then he turned and cracked the egg over his rice, adding a leaf of dried nori seaweed. As he leaned back, chopsticks in hand, he quickly glanced through the Tokyo papers, followed by the Asian Wall Street Journal and the satellite edition of London's Financial Times. Finally, he tossed them aside. This was always the moment when he liked to take measure of the 3 photos standing in a row across the back of his teak desk. The first was his deceased wife Mariko, long-suffering, deferential, resignedly selfless. A model Japanese woman. He still thought of her with fondness, but as was expected of a Japanese helpmate, she always ran a distant second in his affections. His work came first. The next picture was very different. This woman's face was white, her hair a lacquered wig, her lips a tiny red pout. Her name, Koriko, had been assigned years ago in the Jin district of Kyoto, and she was holding a 3-stringed lute, a samisen, and intoning some classical melody from centuries past. These days, she purchased $1,000 kimonos the way most office girls bought jeans, but she worked for the money. She was a geisha. A real one, an artist whose calling required years of training and commanded the awe of even the most modern Japanese. Like a prizefighter or a matador, she'd spent long, painful hours perfecting style, technique, art. She had been Noda's one-time protégé, beneficiary of his patronage. Now, though, she had other patrons. He still missed her, but the memory was fading. The third photo was a face familiar to all of Japan's avid TV viewers, Akira Mori. She was wearing a dark blue Western suit, her hair a glossy pageboy cut, the conservative look of times past. It was the occasion of her graduation from the School of Law, Tokyo University, Tokyo Daigaku, or Todai as it's known. An important moment. Todai's alumni represent a network, a batsu, of the country's ruling elite, who compete with each other for the choicest, most prestigious government ministries. Although she had chosen a more visible career, she still relied heavily on her contacts in this governing clique. Heads of the leading ministries, including finance, foreign affairs, and of course the Ministry of International Trade and Industry, MEDI. Matsuo Noda himself had, in fact, once headed MEDI, probably Japan's most powerful ministry. He came from ancient samurai stock, fittingly perhaps, since the bureaucrats of modern Japan are mostly of that class. The samurai caste, men who served a liege lord and were forbidden to engage in trade, were actually Japan's first public servants. In between civil wars, they became sword-carrying bureaucrats. Many a modern bureau chief has ancestors who wore two swords and sliced up a peasant or a merchant now and then with impunity, which may help explain why the average citizen still views government officials with such nervous awe. A Tadai honors man himself, Noda was a natural for MEDI, which runs what is in many ways a covert operation. The head offices are in a nondescript, soot-covered building of tinted glass and limestone near Tokyo's Hibiya Park, guarded by armed, helmeted members of Japan's national police. Inside, it's mostly open floors and lines of gray steel desks. No plush carpets and mahogany suites. MEDI has 12 bureaus, each devoted to a major industrial sector. If its officials decide Japan's strategic interests would be served by a certain manufacturing group's cutting production, lowering prices, altering product lines, these recommendations are passed along. And it happens. Noda began his career there by circulating through the different sections, going around the track, as it's called, after which he proceeded to run the general affairs office of various bureaus, by which time everybody had him picked for a mover, on the elite course. Eventually, he was promoted to section chief in the International Trade Bureau, next on to bureau chief. And finally, at age 47, he made the top, vice minister. After he reached the pinnacle, he held the job for a mere 5 years, then routinely left. He had to go, early 50s and you're out. MEDI is no country for old men. He moved on to head the Japan Development Bank, JDB, where he financed various high-tech startup industries. Finally, he retired and went out on his own. Unlike most other retired government officials, however, he didn't accept any of the lucrative private offers he received, the suddenly vacant spot on a conglomerate's board of directors. No, he had his own smoldering vision. In a dazzling and successful departure from usual Japanese convention, he founded Nippon, Inc., an adjunct to Japan's major financial players, with headquarters in the commercial center of Kyoto. His new organization immediately became a financial fixture in the new post-industrial, high-tech Japan. And now, 5 years later, Nippon, Inc. was a thriving force in the management of capital. These days, even the new generation at MEDI routinely called him up for consensus. For Matsuo Noda now, everything was in place. He was at last ready to pursue a lifelong dream. He'd never forgotten the end of the war, that last day on Okinawa when Ushijima's 32nd Army was a dazed remnant. He'd been in the cave above Mabuni when the general radioed his farewell to Imperial headquarters, then severed his own spinal cord. Matsuo Noda, with anguish he could still remember, had burned the regimental flag and told those remaining to scatter, to become guerrillas repeating Ushijima's last command, to fight to the last for the eternal cause of loyalty to the emperor. Noda had declared that their struggle would continue on for 100 years, if need be. He had overestimated the difficulty. The plan now poised had required less than 50. As usual for a work-at-home Saturday, just another business day in Japan. He was wrapping up loose ends from the week, finishing reports, signing off on audits. 2 printers were running, since he preferred to work with hard copy, and he was reviewing the list of outstanding loans NI was in charge of monitoring, checking for any early signs of trouble. Had any credit rating slipped? If a receiving corporation was publicly traded, had its stock faltered? What was the overview? Securities, unamortized discounts on bonds, cash on hand. Next, he paged through the weekly updates from the Small Business Finance Corp, the National Finance Corp, the Shoko Chukin Bank, various credit associations, and savings banks. It was all on his Kyoto information base, pulled off the new fiber optic network that linked Japan's financial centers. He was about to ring down for fresh tea when a priority override flashed on the screen for his eyes only. This meant a coded message that could only be unscrambled using a special module in the computer. The Kyoto office knew he was online, but they hadn't wanted to route the information directly. Highly irregular. He punched in the code, called up the receiving routine, and waited for the message. There had been a call from ship-to-shore phone, the communications line linking him directly with Dr. Shozo Takahashi, director in charge of his top-secret project in the Inland Sea. The director was requesting that Noda-sama contact him immediately via Scrambler. Top security. He felt his pulse begin to race as he digested the news. It had been so easy, almost too easy. He sat perfectly still for that timeless, historic moment, gazing at the photograph of Akira Mori. A promise kept from long, long ago. 4 decades now, and he had never forgotten what he had said he would do for her. He called down for tea, waited till it had been delivered, then punched on the phone and switched it to the security mode. But even on the scrambler, Takahashi began circumspectly. As the esteemed Noda-sama was aware, their project had, over its 3 years, contended with great difficulties and many disappointments. They were working at the very limits of undersea technology. As Noda-sama also knew, he went on. Their early attempts at seismic vertical profiling had been a complete failure. Takahashi took personal responsibility for that. Next, they had changed strategy and utilized state-of-the-art microwave radar, hoping that minuscule changes in density along the bottom might indicate what they sought. That, too, Takahashi apologized, had been unproductive from the start as Noda-sama had been informed, and he, Takahashi, took full blame for the failure. Noda cut in at that point, impatient and wanting to circumvent the litany of apologies. Why was Takahashi calling? The director paused dramatically, then declared he wished to inform the august Noda-sama that their latest approach, the use of a new digital magnetometer, had at last borne fruit. Only this morning they had detected and brought up an item. In the treacherous straits east-northeast of Shikoku, it was a watertight gold case embossed with what appeared to be a 16-leaf chrysanthemum, or kiku, the imperial insignia. Other confirming inscriptions. Noda nervously reached out and clicked off the humming computer. Yes, the formal script across one end appeared to be no later than 10th century. Although they dared not open the gold case for fear of damaging its contents, at this moment, preliminary analytical procedures were underway, and the early results, including a makeshift attempt at shipboard X-ray crystallography, suggested that the steel inside, which clearly showed traces of copper alloy, contained less than 0.01% of iron oxide. In short, it was possible the item might be perfectly preserved. It was theirs, Takahashi said, in that breathy, clipped language inferiors used to signify great importance and great deference. It was his extreme honor to announce to the esteemed Noda-sama that the most important archaeological find in the history of Japan now belonged to Nippon, Inc. And they. Chigao, Noda cut him off, in the curt tone expected of superiors. Incorrect. It belonged to its rightful owner and would now be returned. And furthermore, he added, Nippon, Inc. had just ceased to exist. Since the name for ancient Japan was Dai Nippon, Great Japan. As of this moment, Nippon, Inc. had just become Dai Nippon International. A complete reorganization would begin immediately. Finally, he ordered a total blackout. Radios silenced. No shore leave for crew or scientists. He clicked off the phone and, repressing a tremble, descended the stairs. And there on the garden veranda, using a new brush and perfumed sumi ink from his rare collection, Matsuo Noda composed a very elaborate letter, long swirls of black down a perfect sheet of thick, flowered paper hundreds of years old. It was then sealed in a silver case and hand-delivered by special messenger to a fortress inn, the center of Tokyo. 5 days later, its recipient read it before a nationally televised press conference, and Japan exploded. Chapter 5. Kami wo aretai no desu ga. Iai desu ka. Tam peered through the doorway and nodded hello to the girl in the blue Imperial Hotel uniform. The hair salon was almost empty. Perfect. Hi so. The girl, startled at the Gaijin's accentless Japanese, bowed to the waist. Dozo. Manicure mo wangai shimasu. What the heck, Tam thought. Why not go all the way, get a manicure too? Hi, dozo. Another bob as the girl ushered her forward. There was the plush, padded chair. Big, gray, and voluptuous. She sighed and settled back. Heaven. Perfect peace in the middle of hectic Tokyo. She knew that here for an hour or so she would be an honored guest, smothered with attention. One of the most incredible experiences in Japan. While 3 of the girls began shampooing her hair, they went back to chattering about the new husband a matchmaker had just arranged for the petite assistant in the back. The bride-to-be was blushing, and there were plenty of giggles all around, hands over mouths. Tam realized, though, that the girls were being a little circumspect. Who was this strange brunette Gaijin, speaking Japanese with no accent? Maybe she understood what they were saying. She did. The woman who would become Tam Richardson was born Tamara No Name in Kobe, Japan. The somewhat embarrassing result of an evening's diversion for an anonymous GI. Her mother, equally anonymous, had prudently given her over for adoption, rather than face the social awkwardness of raising a fatherless, half-Gaijin child. She was eventually adopted by Lieutenant Colonel Avery Richardson, U.S. Air Force, and his wife Mary, proud Iowa. Stock 6 years after she'd been stuck in the orphanage. That was during the latter days of the occupation, but they'd stayed on in Japan through '54, while Lieutenant Colonel Richardson served as advisor for the rearming of what would be the Japanese Self-Defense Forces. He'd also become a Japanophile by then, so he left her in a Japanese school rather than subjecting her to the army brats on the base. Finally, they returned to the States. With a dark-eyed little daughter who'd spoken Japanese for almost a decade, and being the achiever she was, read it virtually as well as a high school graduate. The thing she remembered best from all those years, though, was one word. Gaijin. It wasn't exactly that the modern Japanese consider Gaijin inferior. They no longer dismiss Westerners as red-bearded barbarians. No, Gaijin were merely unfortunate, luckless folk, not part of the Earth's elect tribe. You were either born a part of Japan, a full Nihonjin, or you were forever outside of it, Gaijin. But knowing it was one thing, and living it as a kid was something else. She wasn't one of them, and they made sure she got the message. Finally, however, she discovered the hidden secret of Japan. Most Japanese get very uncomfortable around a Gaijin too fluent in their language or customs, since that outsider has penetrated their life without the constraint of relationships and obligations. No Gaijin can ever entirely belong to their seamless culture for one simple reason. No outsider could ever be held accountable to the powerful social and family interdependencies that allow a population half that of the U.S. to get along in a place functionally smaller than California. So to survive there, if you're not Nihonjin, you just play that fact for all it's worth. Then, like everybody else, you've got a niche. Yours merely happens to be outside the system. As an almost Nihonjin, you're threatening. As a Gaijin, you're safe. She'd finally learned this the hard way from all those unsmiling little girls in blue school uniforms who used to hiss Gaijin. But thanks to them, Tam Richardson learned to be a permanent outsider and a survivor. Well, here she was again, ready for another bout. Round-eyed, Tama-chan, all grown up and still on the outside. Though she knew Tokyo well from times past, she was still trying to readjust. After checking into the Imperial Hotel in Tokyo's Hibiya section, she'd showered, changed, and headed out for some jogging the best way she knew to see a lot of the city quick. Her major puzzle, where to look for the new impulse behind Japan's big drive, their meteoric move toward the target of Dai Ikai, #1 in the world. Try to feel the vibes, she told herself, be a tourist, and see the new Japan through fresh eyes. If it had been winter, she'd have gone straight over to Shinabazu Pond in Ueno Park to watch the migratory Siberian waterfowl diving for fish among the clumps of floating ice. In spring, she would have first monitored the radio to find out which park had the finest cherry blossoms, then gone somewhere else to avoid the sake-swilling crowds. And if it had been summer, she probably would have headed for the cool of the Imperial Palace East Gardens to catch the pink and red azaleas. Autumn, though, was a time for swallowing the city whole. She started with the Meiji Shrine, that garish tribute to Japan's westernization, then moved on to the Imperial Palace, itself a place that, like Tokyo itself, had something for all seasons. She passed through the East Gardens, watching provincial honeymooners snapping pictures for the parents back home, then worked her way across toward the Sakurademan Gate so she could follow the palace moat as she made her circuit back to the hotel. Along the way, she passed the Diet Building and the Supreme Court, then decided to look in on the Yasukuni Shrine, buried in its own exquisite grove of cherry trees and mixed foliage. The massive bronze torii arch leading into the shrine was always surrounded by stalls selling those marvelous little rice cakes. Sweet and leaden, she remembered as a kid. She stopped and bought two. By then she was experiencing advanced jet lag, so she decided to head on back to her crisp-sheeted bed at the Imperial. Tokyo this time around was as impossible as always, maybe more so. Where do you start? The garish Ginza, the self-conscious trendiness of Roppongi, the skyscrapers of Shinjuku, solemn Marunouchi, all of it engulfing, awesomely materialistic. Each trip the city seemed to get bigger, louder, more everything. More cars, more neon. More, yes, more money. She could remember almost a time when this town was a burned-out ruin. Now, she needed some time to think, to work out a game plan. Sure, clues to the phenomenon of modern Japan were everywhere: drive, self-confidence, competence, but how did they fit together? Change was coming like an avalanche. Who could keep track? The best thing, she told herself, was to start with a clear head, back off for a while. After all, the last year had been much toil and little play, with the latest book coming out, Hassles at the University. She needed some unwinding. Maybe a little time spent thinking about nothing would be best of all. So for days she lived off room service, immersed herself in the local papers, magazines, TV, and just relaxed. She let Alan's hints about some ominous new development slip way down the scale. One of the things she couldn't help noticing, though, was an odd stirring in the newspapers, something very much between the lines, but all the more real for that very reason. In typical fashion, signals were going out that a major event was in store. The government, she knew, always used a kind of early warning system for important shifts. Very Japanese. If the Bank of Japan was about to raise or lower interest rates. A move that would impact thousands of businesses and banks. For days in advance, various unidentified officials would be quoted as speculating that maybe a change in rates might be possible. Of course, they didn't actually say it was going to happen. They merely hinted it could be an idea to consider. It was plausible. Conditions might well warrant. Anybody with any sense knew immediately this meant the decision was already made, and citizens were being alerted to cover themselves post-haste. Consequently, if government sources start hinting an event is conceivably possible, you can usually assume it's as good as fact. But what was this about, she wondered, all these allusions to a new interest of the emperor's? The standard elements were all there. Leaks, guesswork, columns, unnamed, high sources. No doubt, something major was pending. And just to make sure nobody missed the importance of whatever it was, there was even speculation His Majesty might actually hold a press briefing. That last possibility, she decided, was clearly far-fetched. Just not done. A picture session, maybe, but that was it. After a day of unwinding, she was ready to get out and start gathering some information. This time around, however, she wanted a different image. A shift from the staid professor look to high-tech Japan. Start with a few clothes, something smashing/expensive/designer Japanese. And the hair. Right. A cut, a different style, a something. Thus, around noon the third day, she finally got into street clothes and headed down to the lobby, then teeming with lagged-out osses in funny tour hats. She took one look, ducked around them, then made for the lower arcade and the shops. And here she was, already feeling recharged, relaxed, and... Just then, a short, excited hotel porter ducked his head in, bowed, and announced he'd just heard that the emperor was about to be on TV. His Majesty, the salon froze. At first, Tam thought the porter must just be playing some kind of local prank. Arcade high jinks. Then she remembered the speculation in the papers. Could it be true? She glanced at her watch. It was a couple of minutes before 12. The girls immediately dropped everything and clicked on the big Toshiba digital set, suspended over the mirror. Service halted in midstream, just as in a soba noodle shop when the sumo wrestlers on the corner tube had finished glaring, thrown salt 3 times, and were ready to lunge. Then one of the hairdressers remembered Tam and maybe, still believing no Gaijin could understand her language, reached down to snap on the small black and white Sony attached to the chair arm, tuned to CNN's Tokyo service. It was currently scrolling temperatures in the U.S. Now on the big Toshiba overhead, NHK, the government channel, was announcing they were about to switch to a remote broadcast, live, from the sacred Yasukuni shrine. Oh, she thought, Yasukuni, has everybody here gone crazy? Back before 1945, Yasukuni had been a memorial to the master race, official home of the new state Shinto. Japan's militarists had revised traditional Shinto, a simple nature reverence, to include violent nationalism, emperor worship, the Yamato spirit, the way of the samurai, every warlike aspect of national character. These days, Yasukuni enshrined the names of Japan's 2 million heroic war dead, a roll call recently enlarged to include Tojo and others, the the U.S. later executed as criminals which had turned the place into a political hot potato, resulting in an enormous flap when the Prime Minister tried to appear there in his official capacity. So, for the Emperor to show up suddenly, with heavy press coverage, was almost unthinkable. Besides, she'd just been by the place and hadn't noticed anything. This was very sudden. Then the remote came on. The front of the shrine was roped off, right across the bronze Torii gate, with only cameras and press allowed inside. On screen was a shot of an elaborate new dais, where an official from the Imperial Household Agency, the government bureau that kept His Majesty under its care and schedules his appearances, was just finishing up a long-winded introduction. Then it was the Prime Minister's turn. After what seemed half an hour of absolutely contentless oratory, a Japanese politician's most respected skill, on the subject of the country's majestic imperial past, the PM finally stepped aside to allow a tall, strikingly handsome Japanese man to approach the speaker's podium. Since the occasion had official significance, his walk was ceremonial. With his feet wide apart in the jerky samurai swagger, necessitated in days of old by the two swords at the waist. Meanwhile, everybody around him was bowing low. His Imperial Majesty, wearing a formal male kimono, equivalent to morning dress at a Scot, looked truly august. He was also carrying a long silver box, filigreed. When he finally started to speak, the girls around Tam gasped in astonishment. She noticed immediately that he wasn't using modern Japanese. Instead, his language was an archaic, highly ornate dialect, the court speech of long ago. After his brief, almost unintelligible prologue, one of the household officials opened the box for him and took out a long, scrolled document. The cameras did a quick close-up, showing a page of antique, flowered paper inscribed with brush and sumi ink. It turned out to be a letter in modern Japanese from the president of a financial organization called Dai Nippon International. As the emperor read it to the cameras, it began with a recounting of the loss of the imperial sword in the inland sea during the 1185 Battle of Dan-no-Ura. That sword, it declared, signified Japan's physical link to a divine past. What History 101 on TV. Then came the bomb. Abruptly, CNN cut into their normal late-night programming for a live satellite report. Their reporter, grasping a mic and standing in front of the milling mob around the podium, was reading from a press handout that provided an English summary of the letter. Since the CNN signal was being flashed to the U.S. and then back to Japan on the bird, effectively circling the globe, it was a few milliseconds behind the NHK broadcast. She turned up the sound. Noon here in Tokyo, and at this shrine sacred to all Japanese, His Majesty, the Emperor of Japan, cut to shot of the Emperor speaking, reporter voiceover, has startled the nation by announcing that marine archaeologists working for an investment organization called Dai Nippon International have just succeeded in recovering a famous symbol of early imperial rule. A 3-year secret project in the inland sea, funded by DNI, culminated 5 days ago when scientists brought up a watertight gold case containing what is believed to be the original imperial sword. Cut back to reporter. Although no photos of the sword have as yet been released, we are told it is in virtually mint condition. Glances down to read from press release. According to the ancient Japanese chronicles, this sword was given to Japan's first emperor by the sun goddess Amaterasu Omikami, sometime around the year 600 BC, as a symbol of his divinity. Historians say it was later lost at sea in the 1185 Battle of Dan-no-Ura. That bloody naval episode, the subject of much Japanese lore and tradition, marked the end of direct imperial authority here, and the rise of the first shoguns, military governors who would rule in his name. She rolled down the sound. Who needed some English press summary? She was watching the whole incredible event live as it unfolded, and her first thought was, good God, that's like finding Excalibur, or maybe the Ark of the Covenant. Myth turned into reality. She glanced around the salon, and already the electricity in the air was crackling. But what happened next turned out to be the real news, the hidden agenda. After His Majesty finished reading the letter, he passed it to an underling and switched back to his ancient dialect. Now, though, his speech was being translated across the bottom of the screen into modern Japanese. He declared that since the imperial household, through the loyal services of Dai Nippon International, had restored to it that which it always possessed, namely the sword, he was pleased to honor the firm by allowing it to construct a new museum to house the sacred symbol at a site just outside Aiz, home of the official shrine of the sun goddess. On his authority, groundbreaking for the museum would begin immediately. However, until such time as it was constructed and consecrated, the imperial household would make the sacred relic available under heavy guard for viewing by the Japanese people in a temporary showplace located at the Meiji Shrine in Tokyo. By now, shops had begun closing, and the corridor outside was in tumult. An excited young clerk from the flower stall next door burst through the door, and bowing to everybody, lavished bouquets on all the girls. From the streets above came a cacophony of sirens. But it still wasn't over. The most crucial part of all, totally missed by the Western news force, was yet to come. After His Majesty was bowed away from the microphone, another official stepped forward to elaborate on the Emperor's remarks, probably because His Majesty would not deign to mention anything so crass as money. As reward for restoring the sword to His Majesty, he said, Dai Nippon would be allowed to serve as trustee of an official honorary investment instrument to be known as the 800-year fund. Acting for His Majesty, DNI would direct those monies into endeavors commensurate with the nobility and ancient lineage of the Japanese people, as symbolized by the sword. Then, a telephone number flashed across the bottom of the screen. The current subscription would be closed after 800 billion yen were pledged. The president of Dai Nippon had asked His Majesty for the honor of contributing the first billion yen personally. Finally, in a quick aside, he added that interest paid by the fund would of course be tax-free, as was normally the case for savings accounts in Japan. After a few closing formalities, interspersed with a photo session of the Emperor and the President of Dai Nippon, the historic occasion ended with a reverential shot of His Majesty being escorted to his limo. Who was that silver-haired executive? Tarn wondered. The man was audacious and a genius. He just turned the imperial household into an accomplice in some kind of nationwide collection, using the emperor for his own ends, much the way shoguns of old had done. But she sensed he'd touched a nerve that went very deep. A fund in honor of the emperor. That's already how everybody around her in the shop was describing it. Something in which to take pride, not just a numbered savings account at the post office. Suddenly, the girls and their Japanese customers were all talking money. Here was something they could do to show their regard for His Majesty. A line was already forming at the phone. The way she heard sums being pledged, she calculated Dai Nippon would garner 5 million yen, more than $30,000, right there among the shampoos and curlers. The typical Japanese, she recalled, banked over a quarter of his or her disposable income. Little wonder most of them had at least a year's salary in savings. At this rate, Dai Nippon's imperial fund would be over the top. Nightfall. That evening, NHK newscasts claimed it had been fully subscribed in the first 56 minutes. After all, 800 billion yen was only about $6 billion, scarcely more than loose change to a people saving tens of millions every day. It was, in fact, merely the beginning. The next day, more 800-year funds were opened by popular demand. Soon the pension funds started to feel the heat, and a lot of institutions began calling up. Yen flowed in a great river. All those homeless Japanese billions knocking around the world had at last found a guiding ideal. Some rumors even claimed the emperor himself was actually going to manage the money. Tam couldn't wait to get outside and see firsthand what was going on. This was something Alan could never in his wildest dreams have predicted. As soon as she could get her hair dry, she headed out. The girls didn't even bother to charge. Tokyo, 12 million strong, was in the streets. Even in normal times, the city could be overwhelming, but now it was in pandemonium, an advanced state of shock. As she struggled through the crowds, a lot of men were waving sake flasks, already gleefully smashed. The sidewalks had become one vast Matsuri festival. Something else, too. She found herself feeling a little uncomfortable. There were glares, and then, as she passed a withered old man running a noodle stand, she heard him mutter Gaijin. What did it mean? What it meant, she reflected with alarm, was obvious. The world had just become a brand new ballgame. Japan's long-silent emperor had once more spoken to his people, just as he had at the end of the war. Back then, he had broken 2,000 years of silence to inform his battered, starving subjects. The war situation has developed not necessarily to Japan's advantage. This time around he had confirmed Japan's long imperial heritage. The meaning was clear as day. This wasn't a new direction. This was just getting back on track. Even though the emperor had been humiliated and secularized after the Great War against the threatening Gaijin, his people still thought of themselves as a single, pure family. For a time, they merely had no focus for that identity. Now, they had it again. Well, she thought, why not? National pride. Not so long ago, we Americans had the Soviets telling us we were second best, so we blew a few billion in tax money to plant a man on the moon and straighten them out. The Space Super Bowl. Why should Japan be any different? For years now, they've heard half the world claim they're just a bunch of hard-driving merchants with a bank account soul, when they knew in their hearts it wasn't true. Now, here's the proof, straight from the sun goddess. Time to get crazy a while. In the middle of all the bedlam and horns and sirens in the street, she yearned for somebody to talk with, somebody level-headed enough to put this frightening turnaround into some kind of perspective. That's when she thought of Ken. Of course, he was westernized. He took the longer view. Why hadn't she thought of him right away? So off she went for a quick surprise visit with Kenji Asano at the Institute for New Generation Computer Technology, research headquarters for the 5th Generation Systems project. He and his staff would probably be in a holiday mood, just like everybody else. Maybe he'd loosen his tie and give her a little off-the-record rundown of what this was all about. She knew the Institute operated out of the 21st floor of a downtown Tokyo skyscraper. She'd been there before. She still had the address, and the subways were clicking along right on time, though the fare machines were off now in celebration. Half an hour later, she was there. She pushed her way through the milling lobby and grabbed an elevator. As she rode, watching the lights tick off the floors, she found herself wondering again what Ken was really up to. And what had happened to Dr. Yoshida? However, it was hard to think about something as boring as meaty and American defense vulnerability when people were whooping it up and passing around paper cups of sake right there on the elevator. Well, don't jump to conclusions. This paranoia of Alan's is probably just some grotesque misreading. Dr. Yoshida got promoted, and Ken's merely filling in for a while till the Institute can recruit a new director from some university. The work here's too important for politics. Intelligent computers are Japan's lifeline, the steam engine of the next century. How would Ken react to her just showing up? After all, Kyoto was 2 years ago. He'd claimed to be a widower, but was that merely conference fast talk? Best thing is just to play it straight, she told herself. Strictly business. Let the rest fall out in time. As she stepped off the elevator, she was relieved to see that the offices were still open. Well, she thought, my first finding is that Ken Asano runs this place with an iron hand, just the way Yoshida did. Total dedication. Through floor-to-ceiling glass doors, she could see the receptionist at the desk, now excitedly chatting on the phone. Tam waved, and the smiling woman immediately buzzed her through. Just like that. No different from the last time. Doesn't look to be any meaty conspiracy here, she thought. What exactly had made Alan so worried? She bowed and handed over her meishi, her business card. Asano-san, wangai shimasu. Chapter 6. Matt, why don't you just send your action over to the bean pit for Chris' sake? The phone line from Chicago crackled. That's where the crapshooters are. Jerry, I wouldn't know a soybean if I ate one. Hell, half of those loonies over there buying and selling bean contracts wouldn't know one either. Come to think of it, I don't know anybody over on the Merc who's ever even seen a pork belly. Do they really exist? He was yelling to make himself heard over the din of the floor of the Board of Trade. Futures on commodities were being bought and sold all around him. Just then he paused, followed by a louder yell. Right, I'll buy 5. At the market. Yeah, I'm talking 1 and 13 bid. What? You've got to be kidding. No way. Pause. I could almost see the blue-jacketed floor traders frantically hand-signaling each other. Then he yelled again. Christ, Frank, I'm already long 40 at 16. I'm getting murdered here. You guys are killing me. All right, I'll pay 14 for 10. Yeah, shit. Hang on, Matt. I gotta write this down on a ticket. Jesus. I should be selling Hondas like my brother-in-law down in Quincy. Sits on his butt all day, screws his bookkeeper at lunch, and the man's making a bundle. Pause. Hell, Matt, what'd I just say? If I heard right, you just bought 10 30-year Treasury contracts at 101 and 14/32. You just agreed to loan the U.S. government $1 million, Jerry. Very patriotic. Except you're probably going to turn around and unload the contracts in the next 5 minutes to somebody else. Oh yeah, right? I should be so lucky. Christ, where's my pencil? This place is driving me nuts. I think my mind's going. I've got to shorten up some here before the close. Hang on. He yelled at a runner to take his buy slip, then came back to the phone. Matt, you're really shaking this place up, you know. Guys are starting to back away, and the people upstairs are beginning to wonder. You've got to think about going off exchange with some of this. Hit the market maker banks. We can't keep up with you here. I could try to get the exchange to waive their position limits, but don't hold your breath. No problem, Jerry. My client's got plenty of other accounts. We'll roll the next 1,000 contracts through a different one. Christ, whoever you're working for must have coconuts the size of King Kong. You realize you guys are naked here. You're getting short billions. I just handle the orders, Jerry. Your numbers scare the piss out of me just looking at them. He sighed. Listen, Matt, take care. Get back to you tomorrow at the opening. Right now, I've got to find some greenhorn to take a few of these puppies off my hands or I'm going to get blown out. Jesus, how'd I let myself get this long at 16? 40 fucking contracts, and I was sure. Hey, gotta run. Think I see some idiot over there signaling a 17 bid. Kid must be from Mars. Good luck. Right, maybe I'll try prayer. He was gone. I'd known Jerry Brighton since we crossed professional swords once in the late 60s, and I'd never seen the man actually sit down. He gave up law early, and these days he elbowed the mob in the Treasury bond futures pit with the grim determination of a horse addict shoving his way to the $2 window. If the bonds were sluggish, he'd roam the floor looking for action. Football, you name it. He'd make up bets. Rumor has it. One slow day, he even set up a wager pool taking odds on which floor trader would be the next to go broke. Tap out, in exchange parlance. I guess Jerry's own number was pretty low. A reliable source once told me Jerry'd averaged $1 million a year for the past 5, even while taking a hit year before last for over $2 million when a certain famous inside trader sandbagged him with a phony merger rumor. Maybe it was worth the ulcers. Thing is, I know for a fact he'd have done it for nothing. A born market maker, right down to his rubber-soled Reeboks. So when Jerry Brighton started complaining that Matsuo Noda's action was growing too rich for his blood, I knew we were in the big time. It took a lot to impress a pro like him. The thing was getting scary, but it was still perfectly legal. Let me summarize roughly what had happened over the 3 weeks since I had decided to play along with Matsuo Noda. First were the physical arrangements. To accommodate my new calling, I'd enlarged my operating space the back room of the Brownstones' parlor floor, looking out over the garden into a makeshift brokerage office complete with a multi-line telephone and quote services from Estron and Telerate. I'd also installed a direct tie line to the T-bill pit of the Chicago Mercantile Exchange, ditto the note and bond action at the Chicago Board of Trade. And because of all the computer hardware, I had to move Emma's desk out into the parlor. Consequently, she could no longer listen in on my calls, which she did not take kindly. However, I was no longer forced to listen in on hers. I figure that sort of made us even. In addition, I'd set up accounts at every futures brokerage house in the land, both coasts, to spread out the orders. We were moving a lot of contracts, and the big-time outfits like Salomon Brothers were scrambling to make a market for us. Once again, therefore, nagging questions began to arise. Anybody who'd thought about it for more than a minute would have realized you can't make a play like Noda's without being noticed. There's no bigger rumor mill than the financial arena. The very idea of shorting the bond market to the tune of billions and remaining obscure and anonymous for any length of time was absurd. After all, there are 2 sides to every bet. But since I was supposed to be fronting his move specifically to throw sand in everybody's eyes, all this attention presented something of a quandary. Although we were trying to keep the lid on, buying small batches of treasuries even as we were shorting them, the price was softening and margin calls were starting to loom on the horizon. None of this made any sense. Noda wasn't hedging or even speculating in the normal sense. He was playing a giant game of cat and mouse with the markets. This told me once again he wasn't showing all the cards in his hand. He had something major and unexpected in the pipeline, which brought forth the next insight. Matsuo Noda didn't hire me merely because he wanted some innocent-seeming outsider to do his bidding in the futures market. Any number of players in this town could have handled that action as well or better. No, he'd sucked me into his operation for some entirely different purpose, at the moment known only to him. But what, more to the point, why? Welcome to Friday and my rather disturbed life. Want to know what really disturbed me the most? Seeing my new employer on CNN's Prime News, standing there right next to the Emperor of Japan. Seemed as though I wasn't the only one now under Noda's spell. All of a sudden, my mild-mannered client had become a world-class Japanese mover and shaker, and that made me very nervous. Needing a little perspective, I decided to invite down Dr. William J. Henderson, respected thinker and booze hound. As it happened, he had a little time to kill that Friday before his late date with some advertising exec who was flying in from an assignment on the coast. Since 3 weeks had gone by since our talk up at Mardell's, it seemed like a good occasion to get together and compare notes. True to his word, he had formally resigned from the President's Council of Economic Advisors, though he'd reluctantly agreed to serve as a forecasting consultant for Wharton Econometrics. He'd also caused some unsettling rumors in the world markets by putting on some very heavy straddles in December gold futures and oil. He called it insurance, predicting he'd be covered no matter what happened. Looked at another way, though. Bill Henderson was quietly shifting out of paper money and into commodities. And when Henderson started hedging, you knew the weather forecast was unsettled to stormy. It turned out he'd also uncovered a few stray elements of what might well be a much bigger game. Nothing solid at that point, but enough to stir him up. Know who runs that outfit you've taken on as a client. He leaned back in one of the leather chairs in the upstairs parlor, new pair of Gucci's glistening, and sampled his third drink. Guy by the name of Matsuo Noda. Henderson, who do you think I was talking to up at Sotheby's the other night? You check your wallet afterward. We're talking heavy guns, my friend. He snubbed out what must have been his 10th Dunhill in the last hour. You didn't tell me he was the honcho behind all this. You didn't know anything about him. Not till last week. I started to do a little checking, and first thing I know, I'm stumbling across his name everywhere I look. He studied the glass in his hand. Tell you something about this Noda. The man drops a quarter, you let him pick it up himself. He'll nail you where the sun don't shine. Definitely a bad news mother. You mean that business with the sword? Nah, what in hell do I know about swords? That's your toy box. I'm talking about the real world, friend. Turns out Matsuo Noda was the prime mover in one of the biggest takeover plays of the century. What takeover? They don't screw around with corporate takeovers in Japan. They don't take each other over. They take other businesses over. Washington may think that war back in the 40s is over, but somebody neglected to pass the word to Meade. Seems they've got the idea it was just the opening skirmish. The only folks who surrendered were the Army and Navy. Henderson grew ominously serious for a change. Question is, where's this thing headed? Is the idea of turning our industrial base into a packaging operation for imports some kind of conspiracy? Or is it just nature tacking its course? Conspiracy, that wasn't a word Henderson threw around lightly. In fact, he tended to scoff at conspiracy theories, claiming they were a substitute for hard-headed analysis. I agreed. So what was he driving at? I pressed him. He paused to light a cigarette. I bring up this unsavory possibility because I'm beginning to detect a little operation, codenamed Eat an Industry. Henderson, that's my game. I pitch in to help the little fish fend off the big ones. No offense, friend, but you probably couldn't even get into the ballpark where Noda and his boys are playing. We're talking the very big leagues here. Now hold on a second. Noda's not interested in companies. He's just shooting a little craps. From what I've seen so far, the guy seems to be completely on the up and up. In fact, looked at from the long view, you might even say he's putting money into this country. Never mind it's just the Wall Street casino. Sure he is. It's like he first kicks the shit out of you, then hands you a Coke so's you'll feel refreshed. What in hell are you talking about? Well, let's back up a notch. Since I don't want to badmouth your new client, why don't you let me give you what I'll call a purely hypothetical case? He sipped at his scotch. Let's suppose you were a Japanese guy, like Matsuo Noda for instance, and you wanted to take over some strategic American industry and ship it to Japan. How'd you go about it? Well, Have a drink, counselor. He plunged forward. And let me tell you a little fairy tale about how Matsuo Noda ate the American semiconductor industry. Noda. It was meaty, actually. But Noda was running the ministry when they did it, and he was the guy who set up the play. Noda ran meaty. This was news to me. Yep, vice minister. Then he went on to greener pastures, being the Japan Development Bank, and left the details to another meaty honcho by the name of Kenji Asano. According to my sources, though, it was Noda who handled the tricky part, the money, after he went over to the bank. Got it together, laundered it, and dispensed it. Laundered it. Can't think of a better word. Meaty carefully made sure the kickoff funding from the Japan Development Bank got passed through a shell organization called the Japan Electronic Computer Company, hoping nobody would trace it back to the government. I think you're starting to see things, but I'd like to hear this little fantasy. Okay, off we go to the land of make-believe. Once upon a time, not too long ago, and not too far away, a few guys at Intel or Bell Labs or some damn place got the mind-boggling idea you could shrink down a computer's memory and put it onto a little sliver of silicon no bigger than a horsefly's ass. Various outfits tinkered around with the concept, and eventually it got commercialized. Lo and behold, Silicon Valley was born, where they start turning 'em out by the bucketful. By 78, we're talking a $5 billion industry. Kids barely old enough to drink legal got so rich they just gave up counting the money. The American dream, Herr Doctor. That it was. Now, they were making a memory chip called a 16K RAM. That's 16,000 bits of random access memory storage. Orders are pouring in, and they can't buy the BMWs fast enough out in Silicon Valley. I know all about that. Well, there's more. Seems Noda and Asano and their honchos at Meaty had been watching this and thinking over the situation. They decided, probably rightly, that whoever's got the inside track on these computer chips has the future by the balls. 20 years from now, there's nothing gonna be made, except maybe wheelbarrows, that don't use these gadgets. So round about 75, they concluded they ought to be the ones in the driver's seat. Meaty targeted integrated circuits. Well, why not? We're the ones told them they were supposed to be capitalists. In truth, but just like in Fairyland, our princess had a problem. See, these chips weren't as simple to copy as an internal combustion engine or even a transistor. They are a heck of a lot more complicated. And to make things worse, back when America was inventing these silicon marvels, nobody in Japan would have known one if it had bit him on the butt. So it's a tall order. He crumpled an empty cigarette pack and reached in his coat for another. Now, imagine you're these guys in Meaty. You want to take over an industry you don't know the first thing about. How are you going to start? I'd probably begin by licensing the patents. Nice try, but you don't want this job to be too straightforward. Then everybody'll suspect what's happening, and besides, it wouldn't be as much fun. So if you're this guy Noda, you decide to set up a sort of Manhattan Project, like America had to make the first A-bomb. You go over to see Nippon Telephone and Telegraph, their AT&T, and you say, boys, we just decided you're gonna pitch in with all you got. After that, you commandeer some labs at Toshiba and NEC. Then you get yourself a batch of these little American gizmos and start trying to figure out how the hell they work. Henderson poured himself another drink, then turned back. Now, since you need to catch up fast, you do a little reverse engineering, which means you steal the other guy's R&D. You take a bunch apart and decide you'll go with the 16K RAM chip made by Mostek, a big outfit here that's since gone belly up, by the way, thanks to our friends at Meaty. And by 1978, you've made yourself a Mostek clone. Bingo, you've got the technology. I think I'm beginning to get the drift. Whoa, buddy, you're just starting to get rolling. he forged on. By this time, everybody's wanting these chips, so all of a sudden Silicon Valley can't keep up. Now you and your boys at Meaty are ready to move. You've got the know-how, so all you need to do is start turning them out by the truckload. Of course, that takes millions and millions in plant investment, so you do what Asano did. Bring your old pal Noda back into the picture. Since he's now running the Japan Development Bank, he obligingly lines up a whole shitload of cheap money for these outfits gearing up to chop America's nuts off. All in all, he gets together what amounts to a subsidy of low-interest bucks to the tune of about $2 billion. All carefully laundered. Ready, set, go. Silicon Valley glances up from counting its receipts, and all of a sudden, from out of nowhere, here come your Japanese chips. Real cheap, since you've got all these cheapo loans to capitalize your plants. Inside a year, you've got nearly half the market. Now you figure somebody's surely going to blow the whistle, so you can't believe your luck when Silicon Valley thinks you're some kind of joke. Come on in, they say, and sell as many of those crappy 16K models you can, since we've got ourselves a hot 64K version cooking, and that's where we're gonna make our real killing. When you hear this, you do a quick retool. And while the Valley is seeing how sexy and expensive a design they can come up with, your thrifty gang back home just sticks together a bigger version of that 16K chip you stole from Mostek in the first place, and you're out front with a 64K. Now it's time for hardball. So you flood America with these things. You drop the price of your 64K RAM chips from $30 down to half a buck, when they still cost over $1 to make. Before you know it, you've got 70% of the American market. You're selling at a loss, dumping. Exactly, cause at this stage you don't care beans about profit. What you're going for is the big fish market share. Henderson lit yet another Dunhill. And sure enough, when it comes to the next generation, the 256K memory chip, you've got 90% of the action. In very short order, most of your American competition folds. You ate them. Matter of fact, Intel, which started it all, dropped out of RAM chips altogether, which is kind of like Xerox throwing in the towel on copiers. This is less than a decade after Meaty's startup, in an industry born in the USA. Hi-ho, silicon away. But it cost a bundle. Short-term, sure, but now the future's wide open. You live happily ever after, my friend, just like in Fairyland, because big, bad America's dead and gone in the high-volume end of semiconductors. But Meaty can't use dumping as a regular strategy. After all, it is illegal. Well now, ain't that a fact? He exhaled a lungful of smoke and coughed. So selling your ass, but just take yourself a cruise down 11th Avenue, and you'll meet up with a lot of entrepreneurial ladies who understand the reality of market forces. You've got to get caught, tried, convicted. If it ever does get that far, the most that's going to happen is a fine. A lot of folks claim Meaty's dumped TVs, cars, steel, textiles. You name it. So when they decided to move on memory chips, Asano was given a free hand to do it the quickest way he knew how. And your buddy Noda ain't exactly a pussycat either, the way he laundered the Japanese taxpayers' money into them low-interest, Manana loans. As he returned to his scotch, I sat there trying to think. What Henderson had just described was a fundamental insight into how high-tech industries operate. Henderson, do you realize what you're saying? That's a beautiful way to knock out a country's high-tech research capability. Take away the volume end of an operation, and there goes your cash. Pretty soon you can't afford to finance any more R&D, which means that sooner or later you're selling yesterday's news. You can kiss goodbye to your technological edge right across the board. Correct. America's semiconductor boys were figuring to use the profits from memory chips to pay for research in logic chips, where you put a whole computer's wiring on a chip. But now, the money's gone. What it really means is end of ball game in information processing. Maybe it won't happen tomorrow, but there's no doubt it's just a matter of time. You dominate semiconductors. Sooner or later, you're just naturally going to control computer technology and all that goes with it. I even met a guy a while back who claimed that whoever's ahead in computers is eventually going to have the say-so about who has advanced weapons technology. Could be, I thought, but that last extrapolation was a stretch. Bill, I think you're talking a pretty long line of dominoes. For one thing, we've still got plenty of computer research here. The US has a big lead in logic chips. True. Who the hell can crystal ball this one? All I know is Intel was claiming exactly the same thing about memory chips a few years back, just before Asano and Noda and their pals chewed them up and spit them out. All I'm saying is, you'd better watch your backside. He examined his drink and reached for the ice bucket. About that time, Ben came lumbering up the stairs to observe our maudlin ruminations. I watched as he settled himself near my feet with a grunt, then plopped his chin down on his paws. Well, your fairy tale about Meaty may or may not be true, but that's water over the dam. Besides, who are we to be pointing a finger? The U.S. has done its share of tinkering with foreign governments, making the world safe for American shareholders. Hey, I make a profession of separating pious pronouncements from reality. I never take an official story at face value. Okay, so Noda says he's just playing the market. But if he's actually planning something else, then what is it? Don't have the foggiest. Wish I did. He glanced at his watch. But I do know duty's about to call. I'd better get uptown if I expect to have any female companionship for the apocalypse. Take it easy. Nobody flies on schedule anymore. I settled back into my chair and glanced up at the large Japanese screen I had mounted on the wall opposite. It was Momoyama, around 1600, the time when the most recent crowd of shoguns took over Japan. Against a gilded background was a fierce eagle, perched menacingly on a pine branch. The thing was so powerful, I just kept the rest of the room bare. Nothing else I owned could stand up to it. You know, Henderson, the trouble with your pattern is that it doesn't quite fit this time. Shorting Treasury futures is not exactly going after an industry. So what's the new angle? Damned good question. He stared at his glass, probably, wondering if one more for the road would impair his performance later on. I guess he concluded yes, because he didn't budge. Speaking of angles, what do you make of that sword business last week? Caused one hell of a flap in Japan, so I hear. Major event. That sword should tell us a lot about early Japanese metal technology. I've been trying to find out more about it, but nobody's talking. No pictures, anything. I reached over and gave Ben a pat. Curious, though, I think I remember Noda's mentioning that sword the night I met him. 800 years ago. The emperor gets caught at sea and loses the imperial symbol. But he didn't breathe a word about having a project underway to locate it. Well, you're my Japan expert. What's it all about? Never assume you understand the Japanese mind. I pointed up at the wall. Take a good look at the eagle on that screen. You'd think it's just a picture, but actually it's an important subliminal message. The daimyo who commissioned this piece had that eagle put on it to let everybody know he was cock of the walk. Means you cross him and you're dead. Symbols are important in Japan. Noda and this woman Mori talked a lot about shoguns and emperors. Maybe they hope the sword will somehow bring back the good old days. Well, he's got enough money to do it. Looks that way. Hope we're not about to get kamikazes with a checkbook. Thoughts like that could make a man real nervous. Henderson rose and strolled to the fireplace. He examined his reflection in the large mirror over the fireplace, then set down his glass on the mantelpiece and turned back. You know, Walton, I think I'm starting to lose my touch. I don't believe anything I hear and only half of what I see, he sighed. Been one hell of a day. Pretty standard Friday, far as I could tell. Well, a damned strange thing happened this afternoon. Some woman turned you down. Maybe you ought to start working out, Henderson. Trim that little spare tire creeping in around the waistline. Still no complaints in that department, friend. No, this actually goes back a ways, to a few months ago down in Washington, when I bumped into a long-haired professor coming out of a committee session. Guy I mentioned a minute ago. The link-up between computers and weapons. Him, we got to BSing in the men's room, and it turned out he was some computer hotshot from Stanford. He'd been testifying, I think, and he was still wound up. Probably I got to hear all the stuff he'd prepared, and nobody'd asked. What was the pitch? Defense semiconductor dependency. Claimed that if we keep on the way we're going, relying more and more on foreigners for advanced chip technology, we may as well kiss the farm goodbye. I had a little time to kill, so I invited him to have a drink. He good as chewed my ear off. Finally, had to fake a dinner date to get loose. Man had a bug 6 feet up his ass about the U.S. buying half the latest chips for our hot dog military hardware from Japan. Next war we fight, says he, we'll be buying high-tech weapons systems from the Far East. Problem with that is, anybody else could buy them too. And we'd get replacement parts whenever Meaty feels like getting around to it. Today I happened to remember him, so I decided to give him a call, ask him if he still saw things the same wav. And no answer at his office, but since I had his home number, I decided to give that a try. Best I can tell, a lot of academics goof off half the time anyway. You get him. Some police detective answered, wanting to know who I was. What the hell I wanted, whole 9 yards. Shook me up, don't mind telling you. So what'd your pal do? Rob a bank? I was about to start wondering. Finally, though, I got to ask some questions of my own, but it was a little hard to swallow the story. What I mean is, I don't necessarily buy what I heard. Which was, well, seems he was supposed to meet with the Senate's Internal Security Committee this morning. Wife says she put him on the red-eye to Washington last night around 10. He was carrying some document he said he wanted to hand-deliver. Something about it had him scared shitless. Henderson paused. Tell you, this is the kind of guy who takes security seriously. When he's worried, we all better be worried. So what's the problem? Cop claimed he's just disappeared. Not a trace.